Welcome, everyone. I'm Amanda, the Director of Christian Initiation here at St. Joseph Parish. Today, I have the privilege of introducing our guest speaker. An internet search of evil actions by the Catholic Church yields over 33 million results. That's more than a lifetime of bad news about the Church, all easily accessed ourselves, friends, family members, acquaintances, and co-workers. During my time here, I've noticed that nearly all of you have questions concerning historical controversies involving the Church, how to reconcile these issues with your love of Christ and His Church, and how to respond when others question you about them. Having come to the Catholic faith as an adult, Philip Campbell grappled with these sorts of questions himself, but he took his studies in this area much further than most. He holds a BA in European History from Ave Maria University and possesses an impressive resume as an author, teacher, and speaker. His passion for history and Catholicism shines through his work. The courses that he teaches through Homeschool Connections tend to fill, and quickly, because he's revered by his students who develop an appreciation of history and a desire to better understand and therefore live well within the world around them through his classes. I have every confidence that he's brought the same level of knowledge and zeal to us today, and that we will leave better equipped to address the dark moments in Catholic history. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Philip Campbell.
I didn't write that at opening. I just gave her a list of my credentials, and she wrote all that. Now I'm under a lot of pressure. Thank you for having me. I'm going to be talking about Title Talks Face-to-Face with History, which, as Amanda so eloquently introduced, is how do we grapple with the dissonance of when we come across what I call the dark chapters in the history of our faith. Can everybody hear me in the back? Okay, cool. I know it's late. Many of us should have dinner. If you do need to fall asleep, that's okay. It happens a lot during my talks. Not because I'm boring. Well, it's just what I tell myself, at least. I know it's probably because you had dinner. And if you do fall asleep, though, at least try not to snore. I am recording this for the people who could not be here today. So the Catholic Church has a very long, rich history, perhaps unparalleled in the intricacy and the influence it's had on the development of Western civilization. The ideas of Catholicism, the institutions that flow from it, have framed the very fabric of our society in the West, whether we are conscious of it or not. Our morality, our education, our science, our national histories have all been profoundly shaped by the Catholic religion, and not to mention all the grand tales of sanctity and heroism and selflessness that one finds in the Church's catalog of saints who are the heroes of our religion. But though we, of course, profess that the Church is guided in its development and teaching by the Holy Spirit, nevertheless, it is still a very human institution and subject to the same sorts of failures as any human institution. So if you study history, as I have, and I've spent 20 years studying it, you are going to run across dark chapters or things that make you wince now and then. These episodes are, to some degree, inevitable with any human institution because we're dealing with human beings who are easily corrupted. Anybody been corrupted in here before? You don't have to, God bless you for raising your hand first. She's like, me, I'm corrupted. Still, though, it's still very unfortunate. Christ says in the gospel, it's necessary that scandals must come, but woe to him through whom they come. So I found that reading church history can be very edifying. It can also be disappointing, depending on what episodes we're reading about and how we come to these episodes. And some people really struggle with this. They struggle with this dissonance. It can even damage people's faith when they try to reconcile the good and holy things they hear about the church that they believe or that they've experienced in their own parish community with some of the darker episodes in church history. So this talk is going to be about how to deal with that dissonance, about how we confront the difficult parts of our history, and to do so with confidence. Now, when Amanda first asked me to come out here, I said, well, what are some of the subjects that people bring up? And she said, oh, the Crusades, the Inquisition, Galileo, what was the church doing in World War II, like all these things. And I said, you want me to talk about all of those? Like, how long is this talk going to be, right? These are issues people seem to stumble over. Now, any one of those issues could be a whole series of talks in and of itself. So sadly, in this talk, I'm not going to be able to go through and address all those things. Rather, what I'm going to do is propose some general considerations to keep in mind when we run across these kinds of episodes in church history. So this talk is going to be more of a primer for kind of disposing your mind aright when you do study church history. But if you like what you hear tonight, then maybe Amanda can bring me back in the future to give further talks about specific historical events. Right, Amanda? If you like the talk, tell her to bring me back again. Yeah. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to start off with is that we need to be resolved to confront history without fear. This can be challenging because history today, more than any other time, has been very, very politicized. And I know it's cliche to mention 1984, but I'm going to anyways. In George Orwell's book 1984, he observes, whoever controls the past controls the future, whoever controls the present controls the past. What an awful statement. I'm not saying it's not true, but it's awful because it makes our history like a lever of power over people. Our political factions have learned this lesson well, because history too often becomes a political tool to beat up the other side with, rather than something we can learn from. This has been going on so long, it's part of our social fabric. In fact, I'd say it's the default way that we tend to think about historical events. It's difficult to get a partisan viewing of history out of our mind, because we tend to think of these events as having present-day implications, right? As if today's ideologies, what I believe now, stands or falls based on a particular reading of history. And if we're invested in this, we feel like we too have to adopt this particular reading lest our own convictions get threatened. And what if the reading of history we prefer doesn't match up with the facts? Well, what people tend to do is they try to make it fit the facts. They exaggerate elements they like, they minimize or ignore elements they dislike, and conflate the importance of things to suit our sensibilities. Now, we often don't do this intentionally. It's just part of the air we breathe in America. And Catholics are not immune to this. In fact, we can be exceptionally prone to it. Our faith teaches that the church preserves the authentic teaching of Jesus Christ amidst the tumults and the storms of time. And we might feel like we need to help it do that by rearranging facts to create a pro-Catholic narrative. And we might get so invested in this that we bind our faith to it. And this can happen. I've seen this happen with people where they have a certain reading of Catholic history that is maybe too triumphalist, and then they later discover that it's not what they thought it was, and their faith is very shaken. Now, this would be very wrong, just like it's wrong to create an anti-Catholic narrative because we want to discredit the church, like we often see in the media today. So, the first duty of any historian is to, Catholic or otherwise, just anyone who takes history seriously, is to just deal with the truth. We must confront it boldly, directly, and without fear, because, and I think this is a great consolation, the history doesn't care what you think, right? The history doesn't bend to a narrative. It doesn't worry about whether you are pro this or anti that. The history is simply what happened, and it doesn't care what you think or what your ideology is. So if we want to understand it, and we want to understand how our religion unfolds throughout history, we have to be faithful to that. So first, at the outset, let's just commit that whenever we read history, we're just going to search for the truth to the best of our ability so that we can be confident in the judgments we form. We don't look back in history seeking to prove a narrative. We just look back trying to figure out what happened, and then we can judge our narratives by that. Now, that's not to say that history doesn't vindicate the church's claims sometimes. Very often it does. The church claims, for example, to be founded on the rock of Peter, who was the first bishop of Rome, And this is supported by all the documents we have and the archaeology. Another great example is that Catholic apologists observe that universities and hospitals in the Western world were the creation of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. And this is also borne out by the documentation we have. So it's not that the church isn't, vindicated by history. I think it is, but it's that the vindication stands or falls based on the evidence, not based on the fact that we happen to want it to be vindicated, right? Or that we are invested in a certain narrative. As in a court of law, our judgment in any historical matter has to proceed from the evidence rather than selectively choosing it based on our judgment. So that is what I would say is the first thing we have to keep in mind. Now, this brings me to my second point, which is making sure we know the evidence. Now, evidence has to do with facts, obviously. History is overwhelming for people because of the sheer amount of facts. I can't tell you how many people I run across who are telling me, I didn't do well in history class in school because there's too much facts. I couldn't remember it all. I couldn't put it together. Too many dates, whatever. There's too much information, and they can't sort it all out and make any organized framework out of it in their head. Catholic history especially. I mean, heck, we have 23 popes named John, for crying out loud, right? So getting the facts straight can be difficult. Now, in psychology, there's a phenomenon called the Dunning-Kruger effect. You guys know what this is? The Dunning-Kruger effect is the cognitive bias that the less people know, the more they think they know. The less they know, the more they think they know, okay? And those of you who are older and spent your life learning, you know that the longer you go, the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't actually know, right? Now, this affects our knowledge of history as well. We may think ourselves educated about a historical event, but often what we think we know is not history. It's a jumbled collection of cliches, myths, half-remembered factoids from high school, and things you heard somewhere. A classic example of this is the Boston Tea Party, which is, of course, one of the most famous events of the American Revolution that we all think we know. Now, we all know the basics of the Tea Party, that it was a response to an unpopular tax the British levied on American tea in an attempt to wring more tax revenue from the colonists. Or is that true? Is that true? In fact, that's false. The Boston Tea Party was not a protest against a tax on tea. It was a protest against cheap tea, as a matter of fact. You see, the colonists were in the habit of buying their tea cheaply from colonial tea smugglers who would smuggle it directly from the West Indies. And this harmed the tea monopoly of the state-sponsored British East India Company. So the East India Company complained to the British Parliament that they were getting undercut by colonial smugglers. So to compete with the smugglers, the Parliament subsidized the East India Company tea production, enabling them to lower their prices to compete successfully with the tea smugglers. Now, colonial smugglers like Sam Adams were threatened by the sudden influx of cheap tea into their market and responded by destroying the tea cargo when it arrived in Boston Harbor so as to destroy the competition. Why would you destroy the tea if it was too expensive? Like, if they were taxing it, it was too expensive. They destroyed it because it was too cheap, because it was like it was like scab tea, like brought in to undercut their own position. They were angry that the tea was too cheap, is why they destroyed it. Now, if you thought the Boston Tea Party was a protest over taxes on tea, you were actually assuming the motivation of the event was the exact opposite of what it actually was. Not cheap tea, but expensive tea. Probably what happened is you knew about earlier colonial protests against high taxes like the Stamp Act, and you understandably but erroneously applied that paradigm to a different event, the Boston Tea Party, which is a very common historical mistake that people make. So that's an example of thinking we know something when really we don't. Now, the same thing can happen when we study Catholic history. Certain details are recalled, but the meanings are obscured, the facts are gotten wrong, and the point is missed entirely. So, for example, we know that the Inquisition was a court for trying cases of heresy, and often that's all we know, and we say that's bad. But what we don't know is that the Inquisition courts were beacons of justice compared to the secular courts of the day. Persons called before the Inquisition were guaranteed things like the right to call witnesses, to cross-examine accusers, to have their testimony recorded and read back to them, to be free from arbitrary imprisonment and torture, rights not guaranteed by any secular court in Europe. So if you were on trial in the Middle Ages, you want to be tried in the Inquisition court because it's infinitely better than getting tried in the local nobles court, who isn't bound by any sort of law and can simply put your thumbs in the screw thing until you agree to pay him whatever fine he says you owe him, right? That's not to say, of course, that the Inquisition didn't have problems, but it is to say that we have to understand the full facts of the case. We know, for example, that the Crusades were a war of Christians against Muslims, but we don't often realize that this began as a defensive war that was summoned in direct response for a call for help from the Byzantine emperor, whose lands that had been Christian for 700 years were being overrun by Muslim Turks, and he asked for help from the Pope, and the Pope called for aid among the Christian kingdoms of the West, and they responded. So we don't often think of it as a defensive war, but it was. At least the First Crusade was. We know that Galileo was censured for his teachings about heliocentrism, but we don't realize that heliocentrism itself was not initially the issue. After all, the theory, who came up with the heliocentric theory? Who knows this? Yes, sir?
Copernicus.
One of my former students right there. Copernicus, yes. Copernicus was a Catholic priest and a bishop who had taught the same thing a century earlier and faced no censure from the church. In fact, he dedicated his book to the Pope. Rather, Galileo got himself in trouble by presuming to lecture Pope Urban VIII on how to interpret the scriptures and then insulting the Pope publicly, and that opened the whole can of worms. So often, the point is, when we're dealing with historical episodes, especially ones we think we know very well, because they're so often repeated, we should pause and consider whether we really know the facts. Stories that everybody knows are often the ones that are most liable to being muddled by the retelling over the passing of time. And to be honest, most historical episodes that people beat up the church about are of this nature. They fall into this category. As Mark Twain said, and this is a great Twain quote, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble, it's all the things you do know that just ain't so." So that's the first point. You get to these episodes and say first, do I really even know the facts about this, or do I just know what I've heard over and over again, right? Another point is that history is often deliberately muddled or recontextualized depending on the influence of our culture. Now, culture is very important. It gives us a framework for how we understand the world and how we understand our own past. Every people has a national history that makes sense of where they came from and who they are. The United States was founded by Englishmen who were steeped in the Puritan tradition of the 17th and 18th centuries. This tradition itself was born out of the Protestant Reformation and was deeply hostile to Catholicism. England was, for centuries, the most hostile anti-Catholic nation in Europe, where public profession of the faith was punished by ruinous fines, confiscation of property, and where merely being a priest in English domain was punishable by death, just for existing as a priest in the Kingdom of England. Now, Catholics, especially Spanish Catholics, were the cultural boogeymen, mustache-twirling victims, or not victims, mustache-twirling villains of dark cruelty, who were the scapegoats for every national calamity. And this prejudice was transplanted to the colonies. Did you know that at the time of the American Revolution, when this country was founded, 10 out of 13 colonies denied Catholics the right to vote? Because remember, freedom of religion wasn't guaranteed until the adoption of the Bill of Rights, right? And that didn't happen until much later under the Constitution. But remember, we were under the Articles first, and for the first couple years of our country, Catholics were legally denied the right to vote in 10 out of 13 states. Now, our Constitution gradually swept away this anti-Catholic legislation, but hostility towards Catholics continued throughout our history, and in some sense, it lives on to the present day. It is just in the cultural waters that we swim in. Our cultural tradition has taught us to view Catholicism as something of a hostile entity, especially Old World Catholicism. Not friendly American Catholicism, but especially Old World Catholicism like you might find in Spain or Italy or in France. It causes us to view Catholicism through a certain lens. a lens that was handed to us by our culture and influences our attitudes, especially in these areas where what the church teaches or things the church has done conflicts with modern-day American values or things that we tend to emphasize here in the United States. Now, at worst, this can lead us to believe in just flat-out falsehoods because they suit our cultural bias. For example, the medieval torture room of the Spanish Inquisition. You know the room with like the coffin thing with the spikes, they close on the people. The Iron Maiden, yes, and the slicer pendulum thing, and all the horrible instruments of torture from the Inquisition dungeons. That simply didn't exist. This was a fanciful creation of Victorian-era authors in England and America. No contemporary source ever mentions such devices in the Middle Ages, nor have any ever been found. Now, you can look online, and I did this before I wrote this talk just to make triple sure. But you can go online and look up Iron Maiden, look for these things, and you can find pictures of them, but they're like 19th century replicas or things built in the modern time as props or as historical examples. But none of them actually have ever been found to exist. But these were written by Victorian-era authors as exemplified in such stories as Edgar Allan Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum, which is a harrowing but entirely fabricated story about an Inquisition torture chamber. Nevertheless, millions of people today believe these tales reflect history and they don't bother to investigate it further because believing the myth reinforces the existing cultural attitudes about evil Spaniards. Even if you're Catholic, you might have just adopted this. You might just think, oh yeah, the Spaniards were very cruel and they just did these sorts of things back then, and you might not realize that it's totally made up by English people writing in the 19th century to sell books. Remember, this is the equivalent of that's like their equivalent of Hollywood, right? Writing historical novels in the 19th century. You wouldn't look at a Hollywood movie today and be like, oh, that's accurate history. And you shouldn't think the same about because you read it in a Victorian-era novel like, Pit and the Pendulum, right? Now, even in the best-case scenario, the lens can cause us to pass over important contributions from groups that we've been bred to mistrust or just not think about. Now, we all know the stories of the hardships faced by the English forefathers in Plymouth and Jamestown as they struggled to establish the first colonies in this land, but we're probably entirely ignorant of the labors of Pedro Menendez de Avila, who was the Spanish governor of Florida, who founded the city of St. Augustine, the first city in what is now the United States, a century before the Pilgrims arrived, and did more to settle and Christianize the Floridas than anything the Pilgrims did for New England. I just read a biography of this fella last year, and he's one of the most exceptional people in our colonial history that I've ever read about, and most of you probably never heard his name, Pedro Menendez de Avila, founder of St. Augustine. Because our inherited bias has taught us that it's only with the arrival of the English that our history really begins, right? It's only when the English arrive that we can start thinking about the real founding of our country. And we don't think that the Spaniards were here 100 years before. Even in Virginia, there was Jesuit martyrs in Virginia in the 1500s, 40 years before the Jamestown colony in 1607. So consequently, we remain ignorant. And this just popped into my mind when I was walking around just before the talk. Back in 2021, we had this story come out about the Comm Loops residential school in British Columbia in Canada, where it was announced that the mass graves of 215 Indigenous children had been found who were victims of the poor conditions in the residential schools. And there was this massive outcry against these schools and against the Catholic Church, and Catholic churches across Canada were burned and vandalized, and there was calls for apologies and reparations and all these things. Well, none of those bodies were ever found. The bodies that were announced were found by a lady that she scanned the dirt looking for anomalies in the composition of the dirt, and she found 215 locations that she said matched what could be graves. No excavation in this property has turned up any body, and it's been almost 4 years now. Not a single body has been discovered there, and the story's been quietly buried. Of course, the retractions of this weren't very public. When the news first broke, of course, it was huge news that all these bodies were found. But then when the bodies never turned up, well, that was just kind of like, I was going to say it was on page 10, but we don't have newspapers anymore, so, it was just buried, right? And probably to this day, people still believe that there's 215 bodies that were excavated there.
Didn't that happen in Ireland also?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe it's happened in multiple places. I'm not as familiar with the Irish case, but yes.
Similar outcome.
Yeah, similar outcome where there's a kind of a sensational story that comes out. And the thing, here's the thing though. The thing is that people are disposed to believe that because they already have a cultural bias that these sorts of things were done. And so when we say, yeah, there's an Inquisition torture chamber with an Iron Maiden, or there's 215 dead bodies at this school, we have in our cultural psyche like, oh yeah, that sounds legit, and we kind of just run with it, right? So this kind of goes back to investigating the facts. But yeah, no body was ever found on the grounds of the Comm Loops school. So the best thing we can do with this lens is to be aware of it. Just like a Pakistani must be aware of his cultural lens when he hears something negative about an Indian, right? Or an Armenian talking about Turks, these groups that are very antagonistic. We have to be aware that we have that lens, and we can never entirely escape the lens that the culture has given to us, even if we consciously reject it, right? It's something that we're just raised with. The best we can do is counteract it by maintaining consciousness of it when we study history and work deliberately to shine light on these blind spots. Okay, now, what about the real bad stuff, though? Because sometimes you are just going to plain run across bad things that really did happen. Like the time that one pope dragged the other pope's corpse up out of the ground and put it on trial, and then cut his thumb off and threw the corpse in the river. The Cadaver Synod, stuff like that definitely happened. So you are going to run across awful things. You're going to run across Pope so-and-so deposed other pope and had him strangled to death in prison to get rid of him. These things happen. Oh, he wants to say something.
The entire Borgia saga.
Yes. These things happen. So we're going to encounter churchmen who acted from motives of greed and ego. We're going to come across shameful examples of immorality, occasions where the church sank to the worst standards of the times instead of rising above it, sometimes individually on the part of individual leaders, sometimes collectively as an institution, right? We're going to find examples of Christians who simply acquiesced to the prejudice of their age. I was just writing an essay a few months ago about the efforts of the bishops in the aftermath of the Third Council of Baltimore in 1885, I think, to segregate the Catholic churches in the United States. And that was formally adopted by the Council of Baltimore. They had an interesting rationale for it. But still, they were basically adopting segregation as an answer, for the racial problems of the time. And we look back on that now and say, oh, geez, that doesn't look too good, right? So sometimes you're going to run across these situations. If Christ founded the church and established it as a gate through which men should find salvation, promised that the gates of hell should never prevail, shouldn't we expect that it wouldn't do that? That it would... we should just expect more from it. And is this really what Christ intended? Early 20th century heretic theologian Alfred Loisy famously said, Christ promised the kingdom and all we got was the church. Is that skepticism justified when we read history? Now, there is no easy answer to the problem of evil in the church. I don't want to insult your intelligence by pretending there is, or that there's some simple explanation that allows me to handily just wipe away all the bad things or just dismiss it all. But I will offer some considerations, 7 considerations, to help us accept this dissonance when we study this topic. I'll start with the most cliche one, which is where we should start, which is the issue of free will. And I say it's cliche because everybody brings this up, but it's important. Christ does tell us how we should act, and he empowers us with the grace to do so, but he doesn't compel us. We remain free to do as we wish. And if we have our heart set on avarice or lust, then being Catholic will not stop us from indulging of those sins. Anyone ever done something even though you knew you weren't supposed to? right? The freedom to sin is just a consequence of God endowing us with free will. And our freedom doesn't simply vanish because we become Catholic. The grace that's made available through the sacraments enables us to do good, but the possibility of evil even remains. And we have to keep in mind as well the church being under things like demonic attack from Satan as well, seeking to intentionally corrupt aspects of the church's life and mission, and also, even just in a worldly sense, the church being an institution that has lots of influence and power, and that you are going to just tend on a human level to have corruption that creeps in wherever there's a centralization of influence and power, right? So we always have to be vigilant about these things and just remember that free will exists. Number two, evil as a cautionary tale. When evil regrettably happens in the church, in a backhanded way, it kind of manifests the goodness of the church by way of reflection, inasmuch as the evil is especially scandalous in comparison to the good that Christians are called to, right? If I have a friend, an associate, who is, say, not of a good moral character, let's say he's involved in all sorts of bad things, and he's corrupt or he steals, it's still bad, but am I surprised by it? Not really, because that's the sort of thing people of that character do. When somebody steals in the church or is corrupt in church leadership, it's especially scandalous. Why? Specifically in contrast to the high and holy calling to which those people should be aspiring to. Now, the Roman historian Livy has a great quote that I love. He says, "To study history is to be edified by the examples of good men and to be appalled by the bad examples of the wicked." Even wickedness, therefore, is instructive. It gives us a lesson of what not to do. Just like King Saul in the Bible or the Nazis in history offer us demonstrations of paths we should not choose. Dark epochs of church history provide us negative lessons of these scenarios where people have used their free will in a way, and we've seen the negative, disastrous results of it, and we say that is something we absolutely want to avoid in the future. So there is an instructive value to it. Third one, I think this one's really important, what I call the lure of presentism. You guys know what presentism is? It's, I know you know, but I already called on you twice. I know this isn't a class, but you got me in teacher mode. So presentism means there's a temptation to judge previous eras by the standards of our own, right? Something known as presentism, right? This happens, for example, when we think that medieval people are stupid because they didn't have the scientific knowledge about germs that we possess today. Or when we apply our own morals about human dignity to an era when these morals had not been explicitly enunciated. You know, we read about the Romans crucifying somebody, and we say, oh my gosh, how could that? They were so evil, they crucified. And it's like, that's what Romans do, you know? That's how they lived back then, you know? You can't take our present-day morals and assume that everybody throughout history is going to have those same views and sensibilities, right? So here's an example. If we look at the status of women under Christendom throughout the Middle Ages, it can look pretty grim if we view it according to our own ethical standards today and what we're used to today in terms of gender equality. They couldn't vote. They had to legally obey their husbands. They couldn't own property, stuff like that. But if we look at it in the context of the past and of the times, the picture starts to shift. In fact, the church elevated the status of women considerably by insisting that the sacrament of marriage required the free consent of both parties, which meant that families could no longer marry women off against their will. Now, obviously, you still had marriages that were economic arrangements or for political reasons, but at the end of the day, a woman, if she was really opposed to it, could frustrate this by refusing her consent. And that was very new in the history of the world. There was no other culture where a woman had that right before Christianity to freely refuse if her father wanted to marry her off to someone. By insisting on the chivalric deference of men to women through the code of chivalry, Catholicism also helped establish the culture of etiquette surrounding women that significantly bettered their social standing into modernity, right? The whole think about all the culture of etiquette that traditionally, at least, that surrounds how we're supposed to interact with women. That all comes out of the Middle Ages and the code of chivalry and these ideas about how men are supposed to interact with women, precisely because men are so much more stronger and physically imposing. Therefore, they're supposed to, as a model of Christ, who made himself a servant, even though he was God, we're supposed to be deferent to the weaker sex, to show them special deference. And that's where we get our whole code of ethics and etiquette about how to treat women, which significantly bettered their standing in the world, right? But we fail to see these advances if we were only to read this through the lens of our own values today. If we were only to look at like, oh, they couldn't vote or they couldn't do this or that, we wouldn't realize how advanced they actually were compared to the rest of the world or what had gone on before. Number 4, we have to keep in mind the scale of evil. There's a saying in Latin, corruptio optimae pessime. That means the corruption of the best is the worst. A leader who sins doesn't necessarily sin differently than others, but his sins are especially scandalous by virtue of the higher office he occupies, right? Bill Clinton didn't sin in any particularly worse way than many other people, but because of the office he held, it was especially scandalous, right? The corruption of the best is the worst when it's a higher office. Now, here's where I'd like to turn the light on ourselves. Would we necessarily do much better if we were in a different position in life? We like to flatter ourselves sometimes by thinking that if we haven't committed a certain sin, it's because we are better than that, when often it's just because we haven't been tempted by it. You don't have to raise your hand for this one, but who in your life has ever stolen from work or stolen something from work, right? Now imagine that instead of the resources of your job, it's the resources of the entire kingdom, and you're the king, and you don't have any check on your authority. Now what would you do, right? There's a saying in the gospel that if you want to be faithful in big things, you have to be faithful in little things. If somebody steals a little bit here and there, what would they do if the scale of that was magnified 100 times? What would you do if you were Pope with your vices, or if you were the king, or if you were the emperor? Would you have done much better than the people we read about in the history books and think about how awful they are? I don't know. I probably wouldn't. The whole place would be burning down or something. Thank God I'm just a podunk history teacher in southern Michigan, So we have to keep this in mind, the scale of evil, that the way these things ripple out and affect things scale up the higher you go up the hierarchy. And before we judge how awful someone was for doing these things, we should think, would I have done much better if I was faced with that temptation? I had that power at my disposal, right? That doesn't justify it by any means, but it does help us to understand it a little bit. That maybe when we read about these stories, these people aren't uniquely evil. They're just regular people with regular vices who were in the position to be tempted by those things, right? And because of their office, they had the ability to sin on a larger magnitude, right? That's a thing that happens. So you understand then how easy it is to stumble in a little thing, how much more in a greater thing. In other words, we're just dealing with human beings here, right? Number 5, historical events are complex. Darn, they're complex. They're really complex. Everything you can possibly imagine has been written about. I got a book on my shelf, no kidding. It's about the output of turnips and clover in 17th century Britain, like in the Midlands. It's very, very precise. It's full of lots of charts about clover and turnips. Everything that's possibly been studied has been studied, and it's very complex. We default to approaching history with a very black and white view of it, though, a very left-brained approach that wants to neatly categorize everything in very simple ways. Good and bad, heroes and villains, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, which side do I root for, right? A seminarian emailed me the other day. He had just read my book, Heroes and Heretics of the Reformation, which I have available on the table. He read my book, and I talk in the book about Renaissance humanism, and he emailed me to ask me, he said, Mr. Campbell, I'm trying to understand, you talk about humanism in this book, is it good or bad? What should I think about it? Now, I had to explain, well, insofar as humanism promotes a return to studying original documents, a knowledge of language, cultural literacy, civic virtue, it's a good thing. In as far as it promotes an anthropocentric view of life that elevates human goods above God and tends to obscure the role of divine revelation, it's bad. Like, it depends on which aspect of it you're talking about, right? He was kind of thinking of it as, is it good or is it bad? So let's take another example. The European colonization of the New World, right? We get tripped up on this one because we want to say that this is bad because bad things happened, but we also can't say it's too bad because we all live here and we like living here, right? And this is our home. Many of us are people have been here for hundreds of years, right? So obviously there are some awful things that happened during this time, many of which were perpetrated by persons professing the religion of Christ, Catholic and otherwise. But the church also thought this was awful, and papal statements during the time are full of condemnations of slavery, of exploitation of natives, and warnings of severe punishments for those who persist in these vices. But more importantly, and this is very interesting, the treatment of natives in the New World led to theological debates about whether humans had certain inherent rights. Because prior to the discovery of the New World, what was the idea of rights before then? Previous generations had assumed that rights came from being under a certain set of laws, right? Like if you were a Roman citizen, you had certain rights because you were a citizen of Rome, and therefore you were free from certain things happening to you. Or in the Middle Ages, if you were a Christian, you had certain rights because you had been redeemed by the blood of Christ, and therefore certain things were no longer suitable or fitting for you. But there was little concept of human rights that one possessed by virtue of one's humanity. Because when we discovered continents with new people living on them that had never been part of our civilization, knew nothing of the Western culture, knew nothing of Christianity, there was those who said they don't have the benefit of these rights because they're not Christians, they're not under the laws of, they don't have these rights, and therefore we can do certain things to them, like use them for forced labor, take their property away. So this led to a spirited debate amongst theologians about where do rights come from? And do we have them just by virtue of one's humanity? And eventually it was understood that we do. An ethics of human rights grew out of these debates about rights that we have just by virtue of being a human being. And this eventually led to things like the abolition of torture throughout the West, the global abolition of slavery. Did you know, for example, that Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery in 1888, and it did it specifically to honor Pope Leo XIII's golden jubilee of his ordination. As a present for the Pope, Brazil abolished slavery in 1888 to celebrate his 50 years as a priest. Eventually, this would lead to the enunciation of the right to life and the dignity of the human person, and this concept of basic human rights is now enshrined in almost every law code in the world. Now, I'm not saying the end justifies the means, that we somehow needed the abuses of the colonial era to get where we are today. No. But what I am saying is that the history is complex, and usually it's an admixture of positive and negative outcomes. You name any good thing in history, and I can show you a bad thing that came out of it. And if you name a bad thing, I can show you a good thing that came out of it too. So it's very complex. So as I said at the outset, we don't read history with an eye towards justifying or condemning it, whatever our private opinions might be. First and foremost, we simply want to understand it, right? Number 6, the human attenuation to the negative. This is a good one. As humans, we already tend to focus on what is negative, appalling, or catastrophic. Evil fascinates us. I'm sorry to say, but it's true. There's a reason why they used to execute people publicly, because they knew people would come watch, right? That's the reason why they did that. If nobody would have watched, they wouldn't have been killing people in public. St. Augustine referred to this as the lust of the eyes. It's the way we slow down to gawk at an accident because, I don't know, maybe we'll see blood or something. I don't know. We all do this. We see something going on. We just this week with all the storms, I've seen a lot of memes about people going outside when the tornado is, it's like, oh, there's a tornado warning. I'm going to go outside and get pictures of it, right? When something extraordinary or chaotic is going on, that's when we're especially curious about it. We take a perverse pleasure in watching catastrophe unfold from a safe distance. Now, to some degree, this is biological. Our brain is designed to recognize patterns and to be alert to deviations from the pattern. We instinctively perk up when something is out of the ordinary. So we're created to take note of a rustling in the brush, a noise in the darkness, any alert of danger. So we should keep this in perspective when people say there's so much evil in history or in the world. There really isn't, honestly. There are long periods of peace characterized by normal people doing boring things. Extended periods of normalcy punctuated by occasional regrettable evils, okay? But because of the way our minds work, we tend to pay attention to what's bizarre, abnormal, horrific, or disturbing, and ignore what's common, mundane, or unremarkable. For example, suppose after this talk tonight, I go walking downtown here in St. John's and I get robbed at gunpoint. So I'm in the bad side of the tracks in St. John's. I get robbed at gunpoint. Now, that event will no doubt be burned in my memory, right? I will remember every detail of that harrowing experience for the rest of my life. But will I remember every detail of the thousands of nights I was not robbed when I went out? Of course not. Most of us can't remember what we were doing 2 weeks ago on a Thursday night, unless it was something out of the ordinary, right? So we tend to have this fascination with things that are abnormal. A history teacher was writing about this. What's his name? Oh, I'm drawing a blank. He's a famous Gatto. What's his name? You know what I'm talking about, Linda? John Taylor Gatto? Yeah, I think that's his name. I might be getting it wrong. If I'm getting it wrong, I'm sure you guys will correct me in the YouTube comments. They will. That'll be the only comments is that I got his name wrong. He talked about his experience trying to teach his high school students about the legal code of the Iroquois Confederation, and to his frustration, they didn't want to know about the legal code of the Iroquois. They only wanted to know what they did to their prisoners. What's that?
About scalping.
Yeah, they wanted to know what they did, how they treated their captives. So this is just biological. Human perception prioritizes what is abnormal or threatening, but we must be aware of how this biases us in the way we reflect on the world. It creates a cognitive preference for the extraordinary at the expense of the ordinary. And this can lead us to wrongly assume that the world, history, or the church is significantly more messed up than it actually is. And I'm not saying there's not parts that are messed up, but I'm saying that because we have a cognitive preference for the extraordinary, the bizarre, and what's abnormal, it can lead us to inflate the importance of those things. Number 7, let's remember the providence of God too. So Christ himself chose Judas as one of the 12 apostles. Christ picked 12 people, and one of them betrayed him to death. Now, Judas's betrayal, however, played into a larger plan of the salvation that Jesus came to effect. In other words, God's providence encompasses even the corruption of those who claim to follow him. That, too, is part of the providential plan of God. But why should it be this way? Remember the Bible quote I opened with, "It is necessary that scandals must come, but woe to him through whom they come." But why is it necessary? Jesus says it's necessary that scandals must come. This is a tremendous mystery that I don't certainly have a comprehensive answer for. But let us imagine what it would be like if it were otherwise. Suppose we had a church where conversion somehow effaced the weakness of human nature to such a degree that we never had to worry about our brethren failing. Our leaders would not only be unlikely, but incapable of moral corruption. Every prudential judgment they made would be the best possible choice. We would have full confidence in the church's governance to the degree that we could just let it hum along with the efficiency of a machine. Just trust that it was whirring along, doing what it was supposed to be doing. Where then would be the necessity of learning prudence then? Where would be the necessity of developing this virtue, or of maturing, or of being invested in the well-being of the church? Would I care about the well-being of the church if I knew that it was just, that no matter what happened, what I did, what anybody did, that nothing would ever go wrong? Would I even be invested in its well-being at all? we might have something. What would be the sense of laboring to build something beautiful, right? We might have something akin to a factory that mass produces Catholics with better efficiency but with less value. Now, personal holiness, of course, is a struggle against ourselves. We learn patience by overcoming our tendencies to rashness, and we learn charity by fighting back against our selfishness. And sometimes we lose, right? I'm sure you all have faults that you work on. Every Lent, you say, I'm going to work on this fault. And then you struggle with it, and then you win, and you never fight with it again. Right? Okay, so you know how this goes. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. I track my weight on an app on my phone, and I was looking at it over the past 2 years, and it was like this. I mean, that's how our moral life is too, right? Sometimes we're doing good, sometimes we're like this, right? So personal holiness is a struggle. Sometimes we lose, but sometimes we win. And when we win, our victory is imbued with a richness and value that comes through sacrifice because we know what the victory costs, right? When you do have those victories, it's very valuable to you, right? It's extremely ennobling of your character because you know what that victory cost you. It's part of the human experience on a personal level. Now, the church is composed of lots of us, right? So we can expect to see these same struggles corporately. We can expect to see that the church's track record is going to look like this as well to some degree. We overcome our sins by wrestling through them, and the church sanctifies humanity by wrestling with human nature. We too are called to wrestle. Now, to wrap this up, I don't presume to have made the questions go away, okay? Like I said at the outset, I didn't come here to insult your intelligence and be like, oh, all the bad stuff in church history, it wasn't actually bad. Here's like my handy 5-minute explanations to get around all that stuff. Rather, if I've accomplished anything here, it's to accustom us to the idea that this is something that we do have to grapple with, but that the grappling itself is good. It's part of our experience as Catholics and humans, and more importantly, that working through those things isn't inconsistent with the faith. In fact, this is what we would expect from a church that is guided by principles that are handed down by God and given certain protections by the Holy Spirit, but also very much a human thing, very much a human family comprised of all of us who are struggling along on the way to the kingdom of heaven. This applies not just to history, but to life in general, to our experience of trying to live faith in the world. So I'm going to close with a few words about faith. First off, that it's imperfect. And it's not imperfect in the sense that anything's lacking from our formulations of faith, but in the sense that faith doesn't give us the sense of finality that we all crave. Faith is something we're meant to wrestle with. It offers a broader view than what we could otherwise have, but it's a view through the mist, right? It's partially obscured. If we go back to the Bible in 1 Corinthians, St. Paul has this wonderful passage. He says, "When the perfect comes, the imperfect will pass away. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I will understand fully." So even for St. Paul, the experience of faith, he says, is like seeing through a dark mirror. There's always going to be a sense of imperfection, of deep yearning, a wrestling, a sense of what the Thomist philosopher Joseph Pieper says, a not yetness about our faith. It's wandering in the murky dusk of existence, struggling to come into the brilliance of daylight. That's the essence of being a believer, right? So we have to grow comfortable with the sojourn, with the provisional nature of the journey. Now, what does this mean concretely? Well, obviously, it's good and praiseworthy to seek out knowledge, to learn, to grow, to understand as much as we can about history, about faith, about all these things. But moderation in all things. We have to acknowledge our limits. There are some things we will never be able to reconcile, and others that might take a long time to understand. So to come to terms with certain things you read in church history, you don't have to come to a point where you're like, oh yes, I'm 100% know all the facts about this. I can universally say this is totally bad or totally good. The state of sometimes not knowing what to think about it is okay. It's okay to read something in history and be like, I don't know what I think about that. that's kind of sus. I don't know what I should say about that. That's okay. You don't have to come to a resolution, right? It's a normal part of faith to grapple with something. Now, perhaps it's part of our Western rationalist bias that makes us feel like our faith will be stronger once we've sorted everything out intellectually. Once I have all the answers, then I will have settled all my doubts. You know that's not true. If you had all the answers, you'd have some more doubts by sunset about something else, right? Just like, if I had another $10,000, all my problems, like if I just had a little more of the thing that I don't have, then I'd be on easy street. No. As long as we're in the flat, it'll always be something else, right? Always be something else. So I challenge you to consider backing away from the premise that you have to take a position on everything, that you have to have a take on everything, you have to have an opinion on everything, that you have to understand one side or the other. You don't need to understand how the pieces of something all fit together. We don't need to reconcile every single contradiction. You don't need to see clearly to have all the answers. We can get comfortable with not knowing. Now, the beginning of wisdom is admitting you don't know as much as you think. We can learn to say, I am still wrestling with this. I don't know what to think about it, but if I please God, someday I will. That's a perfectly valid response to the conundrums that faith presents us. To have faith is to wrestle with things, and we need to accept that to some degree. So, this is what we should keep in mind when we study history, when we are reading about things like the Crusades, or we're reading about, what was the Pope doing during World War II, or all these questions. These are kind of things we should keep in our mind. All the different points I brought up as we go through our studies, as we struggle to understand what happened. And is that going to make all the difficulties go away? No. But are you going to be in a much better place than you would if you didn't apply these things, didn't study? Absolutely. You'll be in a vastly better place. And I found, believe it or not, people sometimes ask me, see, I'm a cheerful fellow of good humor, usually. And people ask me, how can you be so pleasant? You literally do nothing but study history. You're immersed every day in reading about a mind-numbing string of massacres and wars, and like, how do you read this and stay cheery? Well, I find great consolation in history because, like I said, I recognize that I too have a bias for the macabre or the strange or the abnormal. But I've also learned to have gratitude and thankfulness for the normal things and the small things that are there today in my own life and that have always been there in history, right? There's so much to marvel at in history. There's so much to rejoice in. There's so many beautiful things to find. There's so many works of art and literature, and even just little things, just walking through your downtown and looking up at the cornices on the Victorian-era buildings and thinking, my, those are lovely. That people took the effort to put that up for no reason, other than it looks nice. If they were building that today, those things wouldn't be here. It'd just be an ugly, it'd be like a CVS or something, But there's so many beautiful things in history too. So let's just take a well-rounded view of things and understand that God's providence encompasses all these things. And just like Jesus knew this when he chose the 12, and one of them was a traitor, we're always going to be vigilant about possible lapses in prudence from ourselves or people that are, in the church. That's not going to let us become pessimists about life or about the faith and think the whole thing is just a dark, disturbing nightmare that we can only awaken from death. Okay, good night. All right, we don't want to go down that route. We want to maintain it says in the gospel, the joy of the Lord is my strength, right? So let's just be committed to the gratitude for the good things that our forefathers have left behind, and just keep that in mind as we study. So thank you. I will be here to take some questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get into more specifics, but history guys are ramblers, We talk. And I'd be happy to come back and talk about specific things, specific historical events. But if you want to learn more, I do have a table with a lot. These are all my books, or at least some of my books over here. Don't be. Some of them look like they're kids' books, but they're actually not. Some of these are written like for a younger audience in mind, but Any adult could read any book on this table and learn quite a bit. So I'll be back here for a while, and yeah, thank you very much.